You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Reece Martin, who discusses transit systems around the world on his YouTube channel, RM Transit. Reece joins us to take an audio tour of Canadian transit, as well as discuss his recent visit to London to ride the Elizabeth line. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. I've just put it in order for more scarves, so soon you can choose between bus-only or bike-only scarves. Reserve one now by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Fresh Kermit and fresh Elmo. Also, I'm hoping to have some pre-order forms up on the site soon for the scarves, so stay tuned. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire daily newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Reece Martin, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks. So happy to be here.
Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I run a YouTube channel about public transportation around the world, but based in Canada because it's where I grew up and it's where I live now. So I do bring up a lot of Canadian examples, but I'm really passionate about transit and in particular rapid transit all around the world.
Yeah, and you started your channel about 5 years ago. What made you decide to make that first video?
I think that I was looking for just kind of casual content to put on while I was working or something, just to kind of get the city vibes. And I just didn't find a ton of kind of content for Toronto at the time. And so I just decided, hey, I filmed a little video of the train I was taking the other day on my phone. Why don't I upload that and see how that does?
Were you trained as a city planner, as a transportation planner? What's your background?
So I don't have formal training in city planning or in planning, though I did, the requisite courses and stuff in university, talking about human geography, urban geography, and all of that stuff. I did actually spend some time working as a transportation planner because a civil engineering company actually said, hey, like your videos are pretty good. You could probably do some planning work with us. And so I did that for a while. But no, my formal training is actually in software engineering, computer science. And I just am not as passionate about that as I am about cities and transit. So I wanted to do YouTube and see where this could lead me.
What started that passion? Like, what was the thing that kind of got you started? Maybe when you were younger, do you have a first memory of, wow, this is really cool, going around checking out these transit systems?
Well, I think growing up in Vancouver, riding around on the Skytrain was pretty cool as a kid, sitting up at the front and just seeing the city. And it's especially cool because, over the years, I've seen, from the front window, the city change so much in Vancouver. But in high school, I took a trip to Tokyo. And I think that was what really kind of made me go, wow, like we could have something so much more convenient and so much more accessible than what we have in most North American cities, and just so much better in the little details, friendlier, not as harsh. And so I decided from then I wanted to move to Toronto because it was the biggest city in Canada where I was most likely to be able to see something like that happen in the future. And yeah, the rest is kind of history.
That's awesome. What's the biggest response you get from folks when you talk about transit, and maybe outside of the video realm?
I mean, I guess it's kind of just, people from North America generally, or even people from Europe. Like, I think people forget that everyone thinks that their own city and their own transit system is kind of the worst, or because they can see yeah, problems with it that other people can't. Like, you go to, I think my favorite example of this is Germany. German people really have it down on their transit systems and on Deutsche Bahn and stuff. And I get it. Like, if you get stuck in a train delay or something, you get really annoyed and frustrated. But, I think for most North Americans or even a lot of Europeans, they'd say, wow, Germany's got such a great transportation system. They have so many progressive policies and stuff. So I think it's just kind of everyone wants to see their own city move forward in some way. And I hope that by kind of looking at other cities, we can all find things that we can improve on. Because I think every city, whether it be in Europe or Asia, they have things to improve on as well.
We've also seen transit in movies, and recently I think the Toronto streetcars were in the Disney movie Turning Red.
Yeah.
How does popular culture treat transit in Canada?
I think in Canada, it's pretty friendly to transit. I think most Canadians who don't live in a rural area, which is most Canadians, Canada is a very urbanized country, actually, they have experiences riding transit, maybe not as a daily commute, but often to things like, a fair or to a sporting event or just something like that. So I feel like Canadians are generally pretty familiar with transit and they get it. And that's really accelerated in the past maybe decade or so as we've just opened a lot more transit projects across the country.
Are there other pop culture connections that you can think of where transit is kind of front and center, or at least it's given a positive reinforcement?
I mean, there's a bit like, for example, I don't know, Drake has the TTC in some of his music videos and things like that. But I feel like there is a bit too much of that. Transit is like what you take when you're a kid or when you're down on hard times. And I hope that we can get to a place where it's kind of like it is in Asia, where transit is this thing that kind of is romanticized and made like, to look beautiful and really enjoyable. And so I hope we can get there. There is definitely some art and stuff that features a lot of stuff, particularly in Toronto. I think, the TTC streetcars, the older ones, are really romanticized and they are really pretty. So I think that connection exists, but I would like to see it become a bigger thing.
It's really funny when you watch things like House Hunters International, the B-roll they'll always have a tram or a bikeway or something like that where people are kind of flowing and coming in and out of the space. Even US housing shows I've seen on HGTV and stuff, if you're in a city with a streetcar or a light rail or something like that, or even a subway, they'll show you some B-roll of it just to be like, oh, we're, a cosmopolitan place. And it's really interesting to see that like on these kind of more suburban channels, I guess you would say, how that comes forward. It's interesting to see.
Yeah, I think transit systems really do help give cities a lot of their identity. And I think it's something that cities don't necessarily lean into enough. I think one thing I've talked about a decent amount is I wish in Toronto and probably in other places in North America, we painted our trains instead of making them all kind of just plain stainless steel. It's probably easier to clean, but it's a little less exciting than what you see in some other countries.
What color would you paint them?
If it was in Toronto, I'm partial to the idea of painting the trains based on their line colors. But I think even just like the red and white color that we do with the streetcars, like you could do a version of that would be pretty nice.
That sounds good. I remember going to, I think it was in Budapest or something. They had the first line one. The yellow is really, really a great color and fun and really interesting to kind of go down into the system and have this really bright colored train coming your way instead of the other lines in the system in that city specifically are this kind of dull blue, but this yellow, it really stuck out to me for some reason.
Yeah, and I think it's something that really people connect with. Like, I was in London last week and the London Underground trains are obviously so iconic. They have this really nice color scheme of red, white, and blue that's lovely. And in Berlin, the S-Bahn trains have this lovely gold and red look. And so I think that it's definitely, if you have something iconic, people will tie it to your city and it becomes a symbol.
Well, yeah, you did visit England to check out the Crossrail line, or I guess the Elizabeth line. What did you think? What was the response?
It's so exciting. And it also is just a regular reminder of how much we in North America in particular really need to get on with building some more transit because like walking through it, it's just like, wow, even if you were skeptical that we should be investing in transport infrastructure like this, it's just so obvious when you're on it and the convenience of getting across the city so rapidly and so comfortably that this is something we should have in more cities. And so I think it's just it's an awesome project that's super nice and convenient for getting across London. And we should take a lot of those ideas and try to implement them wherever we are located.
Yeah, I was there in 2012 for the Olympics, and I really wish it was there at the time. There was a couple of days where I spent most of my day, it felt like, on the train, getting from one side of the region to the other. It definitely would have helped with that. But it's a really cool project. And, we had Ian Brown, who was the managing director of London Rail, back in 2016 on episode 118. And it was really interesting to hear him talk about kind of the way that they funded it, how the process was going. And I'm curious, what were the vibes when you were there? Like, what were people feeling? Was it exciting, or was it kind of like people were like, oh, this is kind of cool, but, it's another thing that everybody saw coming for a long time?
I was a little surprised. It felt like the excitement was more muted than I would have expected. It wasn't that there weren't really excited people. I was just a little surprised that there weren't more people checking it out. But I think that maybe that's just reflective of the fact that the weather was kind of bad on the day and it was just like a regular weekday and the like. But there were a decent number of people out. And as the week kind of progressed, it was getting busier and busier. And that was great to see. I think they said they had moved like 1 million people after the first week. And so those are some pretty solid numbers. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a bit of a slow burn. It's certainly not this thing that really stands out the way that, say, the Jubilee line extension in London does with the massive station houses and stuff. Crossrail stations generally don't really have that. A lot of them are just like deep underground connected up to the existing lines. And so I think a lot more people will kind of, stumble upon them and find the stations that way. But it's something that I think people will really come to appreciate over time.
There are stations in the Jubilee line that are bonkers, I must say, like the art inside and just kind of the design and how deep you have to go. It's crazy.
Yeah. And honestly, if anyone has experienced the Jubilee line extension, I would say that like the craziest stations there are definitely still, the scale still feels bigger than Crossrail. Like, Canary Wharf, Jubilee line station, it still feels humongous compared to any of the Crossrail stations.
So I've been asked by a number of listeners to discuss Canadian transit systems, but I was a bit nervous about that myself, just like I am talking about New York, because I really don't know much about the buses and trains. I've been to cities and I've been to New York and I've been to Montreal and Vancouver, but I don't really know much about them. But I thought you could be a good person to kind of take a tour with us around Canada.
For sure.
What's the first thing we should know about Canadian transit writ large?
It punches above its weight. And I wouldn't say that in the sense that we have these really impressive networks. I think our networks are less impressive than I would like them to be, but that people really use the transit here to an extent that's generally higher than in the US. So New York has higher mode share than I think any of our cities, but all of our cities generally do, quite a bit better than I would say kind of the median in the US. So even the smaller cities like Edmonton and Calgary have really well-used systems.
Yeah, that's something I noticed when I was looking up some statistics, is that Toronto and Montreal subways have more ridership than any other systems in North America outside of New York and Mexico City. But they also have high boardings per mile, which was really impressive too. I mean, they're up there. I think it was pretty close to what New York's are. Not, super close, but closer than any other system in the country, where in some places like BART, you get to 4,000 passengers per mile, which is a little bit ridiculously low. Up into New York, you get, 30,000, 36,000, I think it was. And then the Canadian systems are around 30,000, which is pretty impressive. And I'm wondering, is that tied to just density, or is it tied to land use? Is it tied to the frequency of the service? What do you think the connection is there?
Yeah, so I think it's a couple things. I definitely think that the Canadian systems definitely deserve huge kudos for their frequency. I don't think on any of the big three Canadian rail systems, so Vancouver, Montreal, or Toronto, you'll ever really show up and you'll have to wait more than maybe 6 minutes for a train, even at the very worst periods of the day. Usually frequencies are better. During most of the day, all of these systems, you'll get a train every 3 minutes or so. So frequencies are definitely quite solid and improving year over year. I think the reason you get that incredible ridership density to some extent has to do with the fact that we are just so infrastructure light in a lot of these cities. So in Toronto and Montreal, both cities have a very congested kind of central subway line. In Toronto, it's the eastern part of line 1 that goes up Yonge Street is, I think, the most used single subway service in North America. So the Lexington Avenue line in New York carries more people, but over 4 tracks instead of 2. So it's super heavily used. And in Toronto, that's in part because it's so well fed by frequent bus services. So you can get buses from that subway line that go every 5 minutes or so from about 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. every day, and 24 hours a day. They'll have like an overnight frequency of maybe every 30 minutes. So they're feeding these transit lines with an incredible amount of feeder service. And it's kind of the same in Montreal and Vancouver, just to maybe slightly less extent. So I would say we don't have as much transit as we probably should, but the transit we have, we make very good use of.
And how are those paid for? Like, so you have high frequencies, and I know here in the US, we wish we had high frequencies, and sometimes we call high frequency 15 minutes, which, when I'm waiting 15 minutes for a bus here in San Francisco, it's a little bit frustrating. But I'm curious how you pay for that. How does that manifest itself from a funding standpoint?
So it depends. In Toronto and kind of in Montreal as well, the cities play a much bigger role. In Vancouver, it's a little less the city and more the provincial level government. Toronto is actually one of the least subsidized major transit systems in North America. But it's kind of, through history, Toronto's become incredibly efficient. So its fare box recovery ratio is very high. I think it's something like, I want to say it's like 78 cents on the dollar is recovered through the fare box. So it's very high, which is probably in part because it's light on infrastructure that needs to be maintained by the system. It's in large part because of that. But I think the story really is just that there has been historically, back in the 70s and 80s, there was a big push to expand service. And cuts to service here are incredibly controversial. And I think it's just because your average Canadian probably, even if they don't use transit, they see the benefit of transit, or they have a family member who uses transit. And so cuts are very unpopular. Unions and riders and advocates are really well unified and come together anytime there's kind of a proposal for cuts. And so even in the peak of the pandemic, Toronto transit service, and again, Montreal and Vancouver are very similar. Maybe your bus service got cut back from every 7 minutes to every 10 minutes or something like that. But there was no case, at least in the city of Toronto, where you felt like you needed to go buy a car because transit had been cut back so badly. It would just be incredibly unpopular here. And it's seen as a really important public utility.
Oh, I wish in many cities here in the US it was the same way.
Yeah, absolutely.
As somebody who doesn't own a car, going around here sometimes is a little bit frustrating, although most of San Francisco is pretty good. But,
yeah,
it's tough if you're trying to get outside of that. What are bus systems like generally in other cities outside of Toronto, maybe in the smaller cities, the Edmontons and the Winnipegs?
So generally, bus systems are decent. So you'll usually have, at a minimum, a decent frequent bus grid of every 10 to 15 minute frequencies. You'll have, usually in these bigger cities, pretty solid off-peak service, solid weekend service. There's usually some form of BRT scheme. Edmonton doesn't really have a BRT scheme, but Winnipeg does have a little kind of transitway system. It's built up in its south. And so it's pretty good. And I think there's actually a number of cities that have really, really good bus service, like Ottawa, which has kind of its own little BRT network that it's kind of slowly replacing with rail.
Yeah, Ottawa is such an interesting place. They are replacing it, which is interesting. And then they had a little bit of controversy. Can you dive into that a little bit about what was going on in Ottawa?
Yeah, so Ottawa's system is really interesting. So they basically had this set of BRT corridors called the Transitway, which is still mostly intact across the city. The issue was that the central part of the BRT system basically cut across the downtown on the surface. And when there was an issue, you would have a line of buses, like hundreds of buses, blocking off the downtown completely. And so at some point, this had just happened enough times that they realized they had to do something about it. And so they built a new light rail system, which is more of a kind of light metro. There's no street crossings or street running or anything like that. That kind of takes over the core part of the transitway. They basically took the bus stations, upgraded them a little, put rails in, built a new tunnel through the downtown, and opened this thing up. The issue is that, at least initially, you still had these massive droves of buses pulling into the stations on the edges of this rail line, which is not that long, at least right now, and dropping off just tons of passengers. And that was in particular creating a lot of issues with the trains, which aren't really designed to just have that many passengers dumped on them at one station. And so I think that in particular led to a lot of issues technically and stuff. The project is a public-private partnership, and I think there's been some, poor execution of some of the elements of the project that needed to be rectified, like, I don't know, electrical systems not properly put together and trains not maintained properly. And it seems like that stuff is getting fixed, but it certainly had a really bad toll on the perception of Ottawa's public transit. And I think it really shows that, if you have a transit system and you're doing a big project like this, you have to execute it well, because if you don't, you could destroy your transit system's reputation, which in Canada, since the transit systems generally do ride on their reputation quite a bit, I think it's really important that the reputation stays really high.
Is it possible for them to get it back, with expansions or with the fixes? You said they're starting to fix things, but is it possible?
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible. And, Ottawa is the city where I do think there's a lot of people moving to and from it. It's got quite a dynamic economy, and obviously it's where the government's located. And so I think there's a decent turnover of people moving in and out all the time. And they are working on, 50 kilometer, so what, like 30 something mile expansion of the rail network right now, which will kind of alleviate some of that congestion at the ends. So I think there's lots of opportunity to fix things. I think one of the best times you can kind of change the public's perception around a transit system is when you open a big new expansion. So Crossrail is a good example of that, but so could be Ottawa's big expansion. I think it's a good time to kind of maybe change some of your branding and change your public messaging and try to push for some increased ridership. And so, yeah, I think they can sort it out, but it's something that should probably have been avoided in the first place.
Let's stay on the East Coast and talk a little bit about Montreal too. I visited a few times for, I think, UITP conferences and Michelin Moving On conferences, and I loved it every time. But what's happening in Montreal? Because they've had a little bit of controversy lately as well.
So, which controversies are we referring to? The REM stuff?
Yeah, well, so apparently they wanted to run one of their lines through downtown, and that was nixed.
Yes,
actually elevated.
Yes,
and then
elevated.
Nobody really wanted that one.
Yeah, I think it was unfortunate that project got canceled. I'm a pretty big fan of elevated rail, and I think that unfortunately, particularly on the East Coast, there's a lot more of an opposition to it, not entirely based in the fact that people think transit is bad, but more that there's a lot of people who will go and compare it to like an elevated freeway, which Canadian cities like Toronto, Montreal both do have. And it gives people this perception that it's going to be this really loud and ugly thing through their city, which is this really effective organizing tool against, elevated rail infrastructure. So I think it's unfortunate that that's happening. I think it definitely sets Montreal back a bit. But at the same time, the initial phase of the REM project, which this was going to be kind of a second phase, the initial phase, which is a 67 kilometer, so something like 50-mile network, is actually, moving ahead full steam. And so that first part of that is set to open later this year. And so on the whole, I'm excited. I think Montreal is not building nearly enough. Toronto is building an immense number of transit projects. It's truly crazy. And I think Montreal, even though that 167-kilometer project is a lot, I think Montreal needs to build a lot more to kind of stay competitive.
What do they need? Do they need more downtown lines? Do they need more lines kind of peripheral? What does Montreal need to improve to catch up to some of the other places?
I think for Montreal, definitely a line headed downtown. There was one proposed by the current mayor, kind of called the Pink Line or the Rose Line, because in French, pink is rose. I think that would be very useful. Toronto, for the longest time, as I mentioned, both Toronto and Montreal have this issue of a really congested subway line that goes into the downtown core. I think in both cases, the ridership, there's latent demand. There's people who don't get on the subway every day just because they don't want to get jammed into a train. And so I think in both cities, building that kind of second relief valve line into downtown, they both have second lines into downtown, but not really into the areas where people are working generally. Building those second lines is just a potential opportunity to open up a massive amount of new ridership. So Toronto is building a line like that. Montreal is not yet. And so that's one thing Montreal has to do. Montreal also really could use kind of modernizing its regional or commuter train system. The REM is kind of doing that for some of the lines, but there are a bunch of other lines kind of to the city's southeast and east that really could use, electrification and more frequent service. And so I would love to see that happen.
Is there a system in Canada you feel is a little bit underrated?
Ooh, that's quite an interesting question. I think the Calgary LRT, though, in the transit sphere, I think some people have started to appreciate it. Calgary's LRT, it only has like 40 stations or so, 45, I think. It's not that big. It's only 2 lines. It doesn't look super impressive, but it moves 300,000 people a day. So it's like one of the most used light rail systems in North America. A good comparison is like Portland. So Portland has roughly twice as many stations, but only carries about a third as many people every day. And I think it's a great case of where Calgary has a really strong downtown core with a strong concentration of jobs. They've worked really hard to make parking expensive in the downtown. And so, people are taking buses or park and ride to the C train stations, as they're called, and using that to get into the downtown of the city. And given the system is almost all above ground, it was built quite affordably. I think it is a good model for how you can definitely make progress to getting even a pretty transit skeptical city onto the rails or onto the buses.
Is it also, correct me if I'm wrong, is it powered by wind? Is it wind powered, like in terms of where it gets its electricity?
Yeah, I actually believe it is. And I think that's the kind of policy that's pretty cool to see in North America, because obviously, like the Dutch railways do that. But Calgary, that area around in southern Alberta, has a lot of wind energy generation. And so I think it was a cool policy that they implemented that.
So you moved to Toronto at one point, and I imagine that you're very well steeped in the system. What's your favorite part of it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. That's a hard question. I have many favorite parts. I think I don't have a favorite part. I like many elements. I think the subway is kind of the unsung hero. You know, people talk about the streetcars a lot, and I do think it's really cool that we have the streetcars still. I think that there's a lot of work we have to do to make them better and more similar to systems in places like Europe. But the subway, I think, gets underappreciated because, you know, it moves more than 5 times more people every day than the entire streetcar network. And it is, as we were talking before, one of the most well-used rapid transit systems in North America. And so I think it's really exciting. And we're building a bunch of expansions for it, as well as other parts of the transit network. And it just has me excited.
I like all the discussion about expansion. It seems, though, that there's always arguments about it as well. It feels like the suburbs and the city have different opinions about how much expansion should happen or whether it should happen at all or how much money is going to be put into the expansion. What's the politics like?
Well, the politics isn't great, but I would say that actually the disagreements are less to do with whether expansion should happen. I think that expansion happening is something that is very much universally seen as a positive and something that should happen. I do like to remind people, and this is something that I think is probably really strange for listeners in the US, but the current conservative government in Ontario, who was reelected recently, really, I'm not a huge fan of them. But what they have done is spent more money on public transportation expansion than any government in history, basically. And so there's a lot of kind of bipartisan support for transit building. The big divide historically was kind of between light rail and subway expansion. So quite famously, Mayor Rob Ford in Toronto was, you know, a very big subway supporter, and his kind of opponents at the city were more supportive of light rail expansion, kind of akin to the existing streetcars that a lot of people are so fond of. I think what has kind of happened over time is the debates have kind of waned. We've started building some light rail lines. We've started building some subway lines. People are kind of tired of the arguing, and there's generally a sense of like, okay, let's not litigate these battles again and again, and let's just get stuff built. And so we're kind of building a mix of everything. We're building in the Toronto region right now 5 light rail lines, and then we're building a couple subway expansions and a new subway line. And so there's kind of a big mix of all kinds of different projects getting built now. And so I think there's kind of something for everyone, no matter what someone's preferred flavor of transit is.
Now, what about just outside of Toronto and Hamilton? There's a loud group of folks online specifically that have really big designs on getting light rail in Hamilton. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think Hamilton is a difficult situation because the light rail line is, and this is kind of something I think you see generally with light rail, is if you have a really successful bus system, light rail, in some ways, it's a positive, but it can be a negative too, because in a lot of cases, you have to run the buses really frequently to meet demand. You actually scale back your frequencies when you move to rail. And so you have to really make sure that that rail system does a lot of positive stuff for it to actually end up penciling out and being an improvement over the status quo, because buses can be really good. I think people don't always appreciate that. Currently with Hamilton, though, there was a little bit of back and forth. The conservative government that I mentioned kind of canceled their light rail project initially, but because of a lot of pushback, both at the federal level and also at the local level, they've kind of come around to it, and they've funded a project now. So Hamilton will get a light rail line. I think it's going to have around 15 stops over around 15 kilometers of track. And yeah, it's really exciting, though I think something that goes under the radar a bit is now Hamilton finally has hourly train service to Toronto all day long. That's something that started up last year, I think, and it's pretty soon going to be half hourly. So Hamilton is getting quite a bit of transit improvements, and I kind of hope that continues.
Well, that's an interesting thought about inner city rail, just because, we're having discussions here in California. Obviously, the high-speed rail line is under construction in the Central Valley. But what about Canadian high-speed rail? Are there big discussions about connecting places? Obviously, you're not going to connect Vancouver to Toronto with high-speed rail,
No.
but maybe, Toronto to Montreal or Toronto, Ottawa, places that are kind of closer together. Feels like that there's some possibilities there.
Yeah, this is something that is a complicated subject.
We love complicated subjects.
Yeah, so there's historically been lots of different proposals for high-speed rail and things like that. Most recently, Via Rail, which is kind of our equivalent to Amtrak, that has maybe some issues that Amtrak doesn't have, a little less support broadly, I would say, because Via Rail, I'm from Vancouver and you get one train every couple days in Vancouver. And so it basically doesn't exist in the minds of most people that live west of Ontario in Canada. Via Rail they've slowly been growing their ridership year over year. And they, in the past couple of years have had this proposal for high frequency rail, which doesn't sound super sexy, but it would basically be a dedicated line where they wouldn't be sharing with freight for at least most of the distance. And that would allow them to operate more service. Right now they operate 8 trains a day between Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto. They would be able to do more like an hourly service. And they'd probably be able to go a bit faster as well. And I do think that there's a lot of promise to that plan. The current government federally has kind of opened the door. It sounds like maybe they're open to considering high-speed rail because the value of building a new line that isn't high-speed seems a little questionable. So it's not entirely clear what we're doing, but it does seem like there's commitment to improving intercity transport kind of in the eastern part of the country. And we are getting some new trains finally. So we have some trains from the 80s and 90s and some from like the war period still running on the rails. And we're getting some new Siemens trains that are, very similar to the ones running in the US already, Chargers and Ventures, which will be a big improvement. But yeah, I definitely think a dedicated rail line of some sort is long overdue and would be super popular. I think it's mainly just a question of, how are we funding this? Where is it going? And that sort of thing.
What would the popularity be like? I mean, who are the folks that are taking these trips between cities on intercity rail in Canada?
I mean, it's a huge mix. Right now, it's a lot of, tourism, a lot of business people, a lot of students going to universities in the towns that are between Montreal and Toronto, or going to university in one or the other city. So there's a wide variety of stuff. I think the big issue right now is that there are a lot of flights between the cities, and the train service is definitely, I would say, competitive. It's unreliable, which hurts, but it takes about 5 hours to go between Toronto and Montreal. So you look at a flight, which is probably an hour between the cities. Once you factor in security and stuff, you're close to being competitive. Trains used to only take, I think, roughly 4 hours, but all of the freight traffic over the years has kind of slowly ground that down and pulled that back. I think that if we had a time competitive option, even if it wasn't high speed, it would be really well used. And so I think getting something built is definitely a priority.
All right, let's go to Vancouver, where you're from, Vancouver.
Yeah.
I've ridden Skytrain before, and I know that there are places trying to emulate it, like Hawaii. What makes Vancouver generally an interesting case study overall in terms of transit?
Well, I just think that really going all in on Skytrain as a technology, it was a really smart decision that was made in Vancouver. There have been maybe some missteps here and there, but overall, for a city of its size, again, I like to compare with Portland, not because I don't like Portland, but because Portland is kind of seen as like this really good transit city, right? And so I think it's instructive to look at it. Vancouver Skytrain has, again, roughly a little more than half as many stations, but carries about 5 times as many people on a daily basis. So it's super convenient, super well used. And I think that's largely because in Vancouver, you can show up at 10 p.m. on a Sunday and you have a train coming every 3 or 4 minutes. And it's just so convenient. People sometimes talk about like, do people really care if the train is more frequent once it comes every 10 minutes or every 5 minutes? But they do. If you know that the next train is coming in like a minute or two, that's a big deal. And people really respond to that convenience, right? And so I think that's a huge thing. The whole system is kind of built on having a lot of service and frequency. And then I think the transit-oriented development in Vancouver is just crazy. Like it's definitely, in my opinion, the leader in North America. It has just an insane amount. When I go back to Vancouver, maybe once a year, I'm always astounded because the amount of new high rises you see. and not just in the city of Vancouver, but in all of the suburbs along the SkyTrain lines is just insane. So much so that the tallest buildings in the region now aren't even in Vancouver, the city itself. They're in the suburbs near SkyTrain lines. So it's just a really cool system. It's awesome to be able to ride outside and see stuff as you're going along instead of being in a tunnel the whole time. Yeah, I can't say enough good stuff about it.
It's also interesting, speaking of TOD, that there's a First Nations tribe, I can't remember the name, but they're trying to build, really intensely dense housing around the SkyTrain line. And it's a pretty amazing what can happen when you have this kind of connection to the city and a plot of land.
Yeah, so the Squamish First Nation has a project whose name I do not know the correct pronunciation of, so I will not try to say it, but it's really impressive. It's a number of towers. It's kind of near the downtown core of Vancouver. And they actually, because, we're guests on their land, not the reverse, they don't have the same restrictions that traditional developers would have for things like height and stuff. And so they've been able to do something that looks really impressive. Their development is going to have very little, if not no parking, if I recall correctly. And it's going to have a massive underground bike parkade. So it's super impressive, definitely worth looking at. Yeah, I think it's a great model. It's one of many mega projects going on around the transit system in Vancouver that just helps to make transit more convenient for people living and working there, but also has the dual benefit of if you're along a transit service, it's easier for people to get there without having to spend a crazy amount on gas.
Now, what's going on Broadway?
Yes. So Broadway is, currently the most heavily used bus route in the US or Canada.
What's the ridership?
It's around 58,000 a day.
Yeah, geez.
On the bus route. It's actually interesting. Most of the other most used ones are in New York and Toronto. So it does really well. So Broadway, the eastern part of it, is going to be replaced by a subway extension of one of the SkyTrain lines that's already under construction and should be done in the next couple of years. And so that's the huge project, going to be super successful from day one. Going to slash carbon emissions because those buses are diesel right now, and those passengers will all be getting on electric trains. So it's kind of just a huge win. Obvious transit project that should have probably happened 10 years ago, but it's really exciting to see it happening. And yeah, hopefully that line gets extended in the next 10 years or so, all the way out to the west to the University of British Columbia, which is kind of one of the major transit nodes in the city that the bus route mainly serves, actually.
Now, you're talking about Cascadia, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. I'm wondering, you mentioned the connection to Portland, but you didn't mention much about Seattle. I'm wondering if there's a reason for that.
Yeah, I think Seattle is just underwhelming transit-wise. I hate to say it. I think Seattle has done some great stuff with buses in particular, with the rapid ride system. I would like to say that Vancouver and Seattle have kind of bounced ideas off of each other for years with that. So Vancouver had its B line, which I just talked about on Broadway, which was kind of, I think, the original iteration of this idea. Seattle kind of did some stuff with Rapid Ride, which is this network of high quality, not BRT services, but high quality bus services with signal priority and nicer stops and nicer buses. And then Vancouver has done a new kind of project with a bunch of lines called Rapid Bus. So that's been really cool to see. The thing I think Seattle is lacking is it doesn't have a really solid rapid transit network. I think it's kind of in this weird in-between of light rail and light metro that is, it's kind of trying to be a bit more like SkyTrain these days, but it doesn't serve the city as well as SkyTrain does, and the development patterns don't as closely map to transit as they do in Vancouver. And so I just don't think it's having as much success, though they're spending a lot of money on transit in Seattle, obviously, and hopefully through things like Eastlink and through the link extensions down to Tacoma, up to Everett, they can start to really recover and start to have a lot more competitive of a rapid transit network.
What's the most frustrating thing to you about Canadian transport?
I think it's just that we don't get the little things right. So I am really happy, as I mentioned, about all this expansion and stuff, but things that I wish we had are things that a lot of places in other parts of the world have, like really good wayfinding. We have decent wayfinding in Canada, but when I'm in Tokyo and I see the wayfinding on the trains where you have these LCD screens that tell you, oh, at the next stop, if you're in this carriage, you want to walk this direction to get closer to your escalator or your exit, or this is the amount of minutes until the stop you want to get off at. Things like that, platform screen doors, these elements that you see in systems like in Tokyo and Paris and London. These are the things that I think we kind of fall down on. We have a good basic service. It's frequent, but we don't have those little touches that kind of elevate things. And so that's what I want to see the most of in the future.
And what about ticketing and fare payment? I know that here in California, they're starting to talk about a statewide program for thinking about, open loop tickets and stuff like that. I'm curious what the general consensus is throughout the country.
Yeah, so that's like another example of something that I think Japan does really well that we don't. So obviously in Japan, they have fairly unified nationwide fare systems where a lot of cards work from city to city. Canada doesn't really have that. So we have a bunch of different smart card systems. The big three cities, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, all have different systems. It would be good to see kind of a countrywide standard approach to that. But I think in absence of that, what would be great to see here, as well as in the States, is just let's have open payment across the whole system, so you can pay with a credit or debit card. And as London does, let's have fare capping. So you tap a certain number of times in a month and you don't have to pay any more once you've ridden transit a certain amount. I think that that's probably the most realistic way we're going to get to a future where we have only one card that we need to worry about paying for transit with. So that's kind of my thinking on that.
That's cool. What are you most excited about in the future? Any expansions, any programs, any policies that are coming up that you think just might be blockbuster?
Yeah, I think it's the two big transit projects in Toronto. So it's the Ontario line, which is also formerly known as the Downtown Relief Line, which is not also a very sexy name. That's going to be basically the line that helps to provide more capacity onto that super congested young subway in Toronto that's, kind of needed more capacity for 30 years, but didn't get it. So that's a huge project that's kind of just starting now. And then the modernization of the GO train network in the Toronto area. So it's being electrified for probably about 60% of its length. The lines are going to get 7-minute service on each of the electrified lines. There's going to be kind of modern European signaling installed. So ETCS, European Train Control System, which will be a first in the US or Canada and is really exciting. And yeah, it's just like a really good example that it's setting. I wish we were getting more modern trains as Caltrain is getting in the Bay Area. I think if you were to look at kind of Caltrain and Toronto, between the trains that Caltrain has and the signaling and kind of service design of Toronto, I think you would have kind of the perfect regional rail system that would be great to see in places like Philadelphia and New York as well.
Sounds awesome. So your channel, you have videos on not just Canadian transit, but all kinds of transit around the world. If there's a system that you would suggest that people go visit, what's the one place, if they had a golden ticket, where should folks go if they wanted to see a transit system?
That's hard. I think, very difficult. I mean,
I know, I'm making you choose.
I can't necessarily choose.
Well, how about a top tier?
Top tier. Oh, yes. Okay. A top tier is something I can definitely do. So I would say London for its design and its wayfinding and its integration of services, being able to have fare zones and fare capping and stuff. I would say Paris for its various different transit modes. It's got trams and the RER and the metro, and it uses them all kind of where they make the most sense. You don't have a tram that you've got to take to go halfway across the city. And if you want to get around your neighborhood, you do have trams. I would say they're also doing things like gondolas and stuff. So Paris is just going crazy with the transit modes. I would say Tokyo for kind of the scale and capacity and convenience, being able to use things like your fare card to pay for your dinner or to pay for a drink right on the train platform is super convenient. And then I would say Hong Kong is kind of an example of, if you're building a system from scratch, how you can still make your system really world-class by building high capacity, really comfortable stations with air conditioning and platform screen doors and nice wayfinding and things like that. So even if you don't have a system with, 400 stations like New York or London, you can still have something really, really nice and solid. Singapore probably also should be in that tier because people from Singapore would complain if I didn't mention Singapore. So Singapore as well.
Well, Reece, where can folks find you online if you want folks to check out your channel?
Yeah, so you can find my YouTube channel. It's just called RM Transit on YouTube. And on Twitter, I'm at RM Transit, same as most platforms, Instagram and the like.
Awesome. Well, I hope folks go and check out your channel. There's lots of great stuff on there, lots of great videos about transit systems around the world. Reece, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's been great to talk to you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. and you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Hitways.